Welcome back, and we are now continuing in our conversation about why we need to confront culture for the sake of the gospel. And the first 2 points we've made in this part of the series is that we are in a religious war, as opposed to a political war, and understanding that this is not primarily a political battle between elephants and donkeys. This is primarily a religious war between secularism and Christianity, which aren't mostly political differences. They are worldview and religious differences. This matters because politics is causing people to leave the church, and we covered some of the data to help understand how political conversions are leading to religious conversions, and those are kind of, two sides of the same coin. And so the so-called political conversations that we are having a huge impact on the spiritual climate of not just the church, but the culture more broadly. Which leads us to the conclusion, essentially, and the third point that we're going to cover here in this lesson, which is that politics, and again, I'm going to put that in quotes, politics is a Trojan horse for Satan's lies. Now, what do we mean by that? We all understand the Trojan horse imagery. We're going to revisit that in a moment. But in order to highlight why that matters and what the Trojan horse imagery represents in this particular case, I want to quickly review the very specific lies that are being imported by the sexual revolution in our current cultural environment. Now, radical autonomy is essentially the core doctrine of the sexual revolution. You see it all around you. You are very familiar with it, but let's put a fine point on some of the arguments, the dogma attached to the sexual revolution and radical autonomy. And the first is the idea that you are in charge of yourself. This is a fundamental claim of modern secularism, modern progressivism, certainly the sexual revolution. And it flows generally in a secular term, in a secular sense, from the idea that we are self-created beings. But what it asserts is that we are our own authority in our own lives. Even people who claim to be deists functionally have embraced this idea that you are in charge of yourself. You are not accountable to other people. You are accountable only to yourself. Whatever moral code you have created is the code that you are entitled to live by. That moral code most often boils down to something like do whatever feels good as long as nobody gets hurt. Of course, we don't spend a lot of time understanding how our actions impact a lot of people, but it feels good to say that. It feels good to tell other people that's our standard, and we're all supposed to recognize that for other people. So the first claim of the sexual revolution, for our purposes here, is you are in charge of yourself. That's why we get to identify as whatever we want, be self-created beings. But the second point that follows from this claim that we're in charge of ourselves is that the purpose of your life is to be happy. This follows logically from a secular assumption about origin, because if we aren't created by someone who has a purpose for our lives and know what's best for us, if our existence is merely accidental, kind of coincidental, a cosmic random occurrence, then of course there's no one to tell us what our purpose is. Therefore, we're left to determine for ourselves what our purpose is. And the best we can come up with in that environment is happiness. Right? So if I don't have the purpose of fulfilling a created purpose, then I just want to derive as much pleasure, satisfaction, meaning as I can out of my life. That's the purpose of my existence. And so if that's the purpose of my existence, it follows. And the third point here that we're going to highlight is that happiness comes when you follow your heart. And we see this message everywhere. We see it in virtually every movie. We see it in memes all over. We see it in political slogans. We talked previously about my body, my choice. And that is the sentiment that I have the right to be happy, and only I can know what makes me happy. And because I feel this is what's going to make me happy, that's what I should be allowed to do. And that worldview informs virtually everything that people think about how we should live, how we should not live, how we should treat our neighbors, and certainly the way we think about all of the political issues. And my body, my choice is very commonly associated with abortion, but of course that informs the entire gender issue. The reason we are told we should give people space to change their body to conform with their mind's sense of themselves is because we're told it's their body. It's totally up to them. They are an autonomous, self-created being. The purpose of their life is to be happy, and the thing that's going to make them happy is cutting off their genitalia and identifying as the opposite sex. And we're all supposed to celebrate because happiness comes when you follow your heart. We're supposed to know that. You know, a Disney movie that I actually really like a lot, Coco, one of the themes of that movie is others may follow the rules, but I will follow my heart. And Disney princesses emerge from the ether to provide this message to small children constantly, right? We're so familiar with that. So our points here are, again, reviewing the points of the sexual revolution and radical autonomy, is that you're in charge of yourself. The purpose of your life is to be happy. Happiness comes when you follow your heart. And fourth, you were born right the first time. And that is a fundamental claim of this entire worldview, is that there's nothing wrong with you. And of course, that's connected to our view of sin. It's connected to our view of origin. But if this is your understanding of the world, that your heart is the guide to truth, that only you can know what makes you happy and your heart will tell you those things, then it follows that there's nothing wrong with your heart, that your desires are perfect, your desires are the North Star that will guide you to life and satisfaction. And significantly, anyone who tells you that you should change hates you. That's a critical component of the message of the sexual revolution. So, if you become a disciple of the sexual revolution, what's going to happen? The first time somebody comes and delivers the gospel to you, which is repent and believe, you know what to do with that because you've been prepared your whole life to understand that the people who tell you to repent and believe actually hate you. You have become allergic to the gospel. So all of these messages that are hardening our hearts as a culture to the message of repent and believe are being brought in this political wrapping, this political packaging, this political Trojan horse. And they are having huge spiritual implications. And so this is the tricky thing that Satan did in this entire environment, is that he understood, presumably, that churches don't want to get political. They don't want to be co-opted for campaigns. They don't want to be co-opted for somebody's kind of crass, greedy, personal political agenda. And they shouldn't. So what he did is he wrapped up all these ideas that have dramatic, eternal consequences for people's hearts and lives and the way they live and how they're going to respond to the gospel. And he packaged it in a way that when the church saw it, they're saying, hey, we want nothing to do that. We're not going to respond because if we do, then people are going to accuse us of being political, and we don't want to do that. And we've covered the point here. And what should, I hope, become clear in the course of this is a mass deception. Now, of course, the church's job is not to be political, but what we need to understand is that the ideological warfare happening in that space is having dramatic spiritual consequences. It's driving people away from the church. It's also making people allergic to the gospel. And many of us are going to say, well, we're not going to address that because, as we've already discussed, we are called as believers to cast down every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. And these ideas that you're in charge of yourself, the purpose of your life is to be happy, your heart is the guide to happiness, you were born right the first time. These are not just claims that have political implications, though they do. Much bigger than that, they have spiritual implications. They are hardening people's hearts to the gospel. So we as evangelists who are trying to tell people about Jesus and bring people to the gospel, the ground that we are planting those seeds on is being made fallow, is being made hard through these set of ideas. And in many cases, that's happening without opposition because we have chosen not to resist that because it's perceived and described as political activity if we do. So that's the big deception. And that's why ultimately our engagement in this entire space, when somebody asks us if we're going to talk about a particular issue, deal with a particular subject, address a cultural lie, a cultural moment, whatever those things are, though it will have it could have political implications as well, because that's the context in which the conversations are happening. We need to be excited and enthusiastic about taking them on, not because we necessarily want to affect the outcome of an election or a piece of legislation, though in many cases we need to, but because ultimately we understand if those ideas go unaddressed, it greatly increases the likelihood that people will spend their eternity separate from Jesus. That is also a really big problem for us, or at least it should be. So this is why we need to confront the culture for the sake of the gospel. Let's keep going.